It was the winter of 1954 when farmer Elias Moreau vanished somewhere between his land and the town of Colden, Alberta. The road he took was unremarkable, a narrow gravel path that ended near the frozen lake bordered by bare willows and a grain silo that moaned when the wind hit right. He was driving his Chevrolet Bel Air new that year, the kind of car neighbors said didn't belong on farm dirt. By morning, there were only tire marks that faded into the snow and a family that refused to believe what the cold had done. For decades, Lake Colden kept its silence. Divers tried and failed. Seasons turned the shoreline over and over. Then, half a century later, a drought dropped the lake 12 feet, revealing a rusted shape beneath the surface. And with it, a truth the town had buried far deeper than the car itself. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Snow had already begun to drift across the West Road when Elias Moreau left his farm that evening. The sky hung low, the color of cold tin, and the wind carried a sound like shifting gravel across the empty fields. He'd told his wife, Marion, that he was driving into Colden to pick up new seed invoices and check a delivery at the grain co-op. It was a routine trip, an hour each way, the kind of errand every farmer in Alberta made at least twice a week in winter. Marion remembered he had worn his dark wool coat, the one missing a button near the cuff. The Chevrolet Bel Air, polished from last summer's pride, rolled slowly out of the yard, tires crunching ice that had settled between the ruts. When he didn't return by midnight, the farm lights stayed on. Marion lit the stove twice, waiting for the sound of the car on the gravel. The wind changed direction around 3 a.m., bringing fine snow from the north that erased every track leading to the highway. By dawn, she'd walked to the fence line and seen only white upon white, no sign of the Bel Air, no glint of chrome in the distance. Constable Drew Halpern arrived at 9 a.m. He was new to the detachment, 31, still formal in speech and reluctant to remove his gloves indoors. He noted the distance from the Moreau property to town, 19 miles, and the absence of any connecting side roads. The car could only have gone north or east. He asked Marion whether Elias had been worried about money. She said everyone was worried that year. Prices were low, feed was higher than ever, and the mortgage on their second combine still hung over them. She mentioned a red invoice ledger Elias always carried in his coat pocket. He kept it close, she said, like it was a second Bible. By noon, Halpern was walking the road himself. The snow came to his knees in places. Near the half-frozen culvert, 3 miles out, he found faint tire marks, 2 parallel lines pressed into the crust, ending abruptly where the road turned toward Lake Colden. No signs of braking, no scattered debris. He marked the spot with a willow branch and kept moving. The lake stretched wide and flat, wind-scoured to a glass-like surface. On its southern edge sat an old boat ramp buried beneath ice and drift. Halpern crouched there, running his gloved hand across the surface. Oil residue shimmered faintly where the sun touched the melt film. He took note, marking it in his pad as possible vehicle path. The temperature hovered at 12 below. The ice would hold for weeks yet, but something about the stillness felt temporary. Back at the farmhouse, Marion had begun boiling water for tea, though she hadn't eaten. She set the ledger on the table for Halpern to examine. The entries were neat, written in blue fountain ink, dates from December and January. One column listed acreage, another expenses, but on the last line a figure stood out larger than any of the others, circled twice with no label beside it. He asked her what it meant. She didn't know. Elias never shared the bookkeeping beyond what was owed to the seed company. He said he'd square it come spring, she murmured. Halpern took the ledger, wrapped it in paper, and placed it in his satchel. Before leaving, he asked if anyone might wish Elias harm. Marion hesitated, eyes on the frost gathering along the window pane. She finally said, "He had words with my brother Victor last week. Something about grain weights, but they always argued." By evening, the detachment had issued a missing person notice to the regional stations. Farmers along the Colden corridor were asked to check sheds, barns, and culverts for any sign of the Chevrolet. One volunteer mentioned seeing headlights near the lake at dusk the night before, though he couldn't say which direction they moved. Another claimed to have heard an engine humming under the wind, then silence. Halpern returned to the lake after dark. He parked his truck at the tree line, letting the engine idle for warmth. The moon was thin and colorless. Snow crystals moved like static in the beam of his flashlight. He walked to the same point where he'd found the oil sheen. It was gone now, sealed beneath a thin layer of refrozen sleet. Only the faint outline of tire marks beneath the ice hinted at a vehicle's path. He switched off the light and stood still, listening. The lake groaned as the temperature dropped. Each crack echoed under his boots like something alive shifting below. The wilderness around him felt endless. No sound of dogs, no flicker of farmhouse lamps, only the steady exhale of wind through frozen cattails. For a moment, he imagined the Bel Air gliding silently beneath the surface. Headlights' dim gauges dead the red ledger floating weightless in the dark. When he drove back toward town, the horizon had already blurred into the storm. He stopped once more at the culvert where the road bent away from the lake. The snow there had filled completely smooth as plaster. He thought about marking the spot again, but didn't. The next day would bring shovels, volunteers, and questions, but tonight the prairie had reclaimed every sign that anything or anyone had passed this way. By dawn, the wind had erased every trace of the Bel Air's message. By the second day, Lake Colden had become the center of the search. The RCMP brought in 20 volunteers from nearby farms. Men used to reading snow as others read handwriting. They fanned out across the east bank carrying iron probes to test for thin ice. Halpern coordinated from his truck where maps lay scattered across the seat. The wind gusted against the doors hard enough to shake the radio loose from its cradle. The temperature had dropped to 15 below. Marion watched from the ridge above the lake, wrapped in her husband's old coat. It was too large for her, the sleeves dragging past her wrists. She refused to go inside. He wouldn't leave the road, she kept repeating to anyone near enough to hear. He knew the ground like his own field. At noon, one of the volunteers, an older man named Gil Crane, flagged down Halpern. He'd found a scrap of paper, half buried in a drift near the culvert. It was water-stained, edges torn, but still faintly legible part of an invoice page from a ledger with a penciled column of numbers beside a note reading fuel owed. In the margin, oil smears darkened the fibers. The handwriting matched the samples Halpern had already seen in Elias's book. He placed the fragment carefully inside an envelope, noting its distance from the road. Could have blown from the car, Crane offered. Halpern nodded, though the direction of the wind made that unlikely. The scrap had been pressed into the snow, not carried by it. Back at the farmhouse, Marion recognized the paper immediately. "That's from January's fuel run," she said. He was worried we'd been overcharged. When Halpern asked if she meant by the co-op, she hesitated. He thought Ray Dunst was keeping double books. Halpern had already met Dunst, the grain broker, who claimed he hadn't seen Elias in months. The man's office in Colden was tidy, almost too much, so polished desk, no loose forms. One calendar with nothing circled. He'd given Halpern a practiced frown and said, "Good man that, Moreau. Hard worker. Shame about the weather." Now, with Marion's comment, Halpern began drafting a list all known debts, shipments, and accounts under Elias's name. He found that the co-op's records showed a missing delivery from the week before the disappearance. The transaction number was present in the ledger, but no official receipt existed. The next morning, Halpern and his partner, Corporal Wexler, drove to the grain elevator where Dunst handled most of his business. The air inside smelled of dust and diesel. A clerk guided them upstairs where old invoices were stored in cardboard boxes. They spent 3 hours combing through papers. Near the bottom of one stack, Wexler found 2 weight slips from the same date, both listing Elias's load of barley. One had been signed, the other blank. The ink was identical, but the handwriting was not. Halpern compared them side by side, tracing the lines with his finger. The signed one looked like Elias's careful print. The unsigned slip carried a heavier hand, slightly right-leaning as if written in haste. He pocketed the unsigned one for analysis, initialing the back in pencil. Outside, snow began again, slow and thick. As they drove back toward the Moreau farm, Halpin watched how the fields blurred under the wind. Out here, evidence didn't last long, a fact every farmer knew and every investigator feared. When they arrived, Marion had guests, her brother Victor and his wife Clara. Victor stood near the stove arms, crossed, avoiding Halpin's gaze. "You find anything yet?" he asked. "You've got half the county freezing over a ghost." Halpin told him about the ledger fragments and the mismatched weights. Victor smiled without humor. "Paper's easy to misread when a man's gone," he said. "You start seeing ghosts in ink." Marion's face stiffened. "He wasn't careless," she said sharply. "He wrote everything down because he knew others weren't honest." Victor shrugged, pulled on his gloves, and left without another word. That night, Halpin sat in his office, reviewing notes by lamplight. He stared at the unsigned slip. The handwriting tugged at memory. Not Elias's, but familiar. He flipped through his report from the previous year's statements from Victor Landry regarding a boundary dispute with a neighbor. The signatures weren't identical, but the slant, the pressure, the looping of the Y. They were close. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Outside, the snow had stopped. The wind had gone entirely, leaving the town wrapped in muffled stillness. He thought again of Marion standing by the ridge, her breath clouding the air. Something about her words stayed with him. He wouldn't leave the road. If that was true, then the car hadn't slipped by accident. It had been guided. At dawn, Wexler radioed from the lake. A patch of ice near the northern inlet had buckled overnight, revealing a dark seam across 20 feet of surface. They'd marked it with stakes until divers could arrive. Halpin drove there at once. The horizon shimmered in pale sunlight, and steam rose from the cracked ice like breath. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots creaking against the frozen crust. The air smelled faintly of oil. The numbers from the torn ledger page came back to him, fuel load, unaccounted gallons, and he realized those digits were not just expenses. They were measurements, distances, or something more deliberate. He crouched near the stakes, brushing snow away until the ice turned slick and gray. Beneath it, shadows drifted, nothing distinct, only shape and darkness. Wexler called out, "Could be part of the ramp structure." But Halpin didn't answer. He kept staring down until his reflection blurred. The wind picked up again, whispering along the frozen reeds at the edge of the lake. In that sound, he thought he heard the faint hum of an idling engine, steady, rhythmic, almost human. Someone had written a number that didn't belong to any field. The next morning brought a sharp cold, the kind that made every sound ring out across the fields. Constable Halpin arrived at the grain co-op just after 8 a.m. The warehouse floor was coated with dust and barley husks, and the air held the faint odor of diesel fuel. The grain elevator manager, Ray Dunst, waited by the scales with his gloves tucked into his belt. He looked tired, wary, but still wearing that salesman's grin. Halpin held up the unsigned weight slip. "This came from your records. Why is it missing a signature?" Dunst's smile didn't falter. "We print extras sometimes, clerical backup. But this was filed behind the wrong batch. No duplicate signature, no ledger entry on your side." Dunst shrugged. "Paper shuffles. Elias was meticulous. Maybe he miscopied. We all make mistakes." The words were smooth, but the eyes behind them flickered toward the window where frost lines crawled across the glass. Halpin caught that glance and wrote it down in his notebook. Before leaving, he walked the perimeter of the elevator. The grain bins stood silent, lids rimmed with ice. He noticed a small outbuilding at the back, padlocked, but recently disturbed snow brushed aside near the threshold. He asked about it. Dunst said it was a storage shed for worn machinery. Halpin noted the keychain hanging from Dunst's belt, 3 keys too many. That afternoon, Halpin visited the Moreau property again. Marion greeted him quietly, exhaustion sinking beneath her eyes. She handed him the red ledger, now missing the page they'd already logged. He always kept notes from the co-op meetings, she said. If anything seemed wrong, he'd copy the weights himself. Halpin flipped to the last week of entries. The handwriting changed near the end, heavier rushed, as though Elias had written standing up. The figures didn't match the co-op's receipts. One column was circled 42 bushels, uncredited. Next to it, Elias had drawn a small arrow and written, "Ask V," your brother Halpern said. Marion nodded slowly. He helped with deliveries when Elias was behind. Sometimes he borrowed the truck. He borrowed it the week Elias disappeared. She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes, for a day." But he brought it back. Halpern left with the ledger under his arm. The wind was rising again, cutting between the barns. In the distance, the lake shimmered like dull steel under the sun. At the detachment office, Halpern laid the ledger beside the unsigned slip and studied the inks under lamplight. Same tone, same slight feathering at the edge of each stroke, the sign of a cheap fountain pen. He made a note to check Victor Landry's handwriting officially, but he already knew what he'd find. That night, he drove to Victor's farm. The man met him at the door, a lantern in hand. "You think I hurt my own brother-in-law," he said before Halpern had spoken. Elias got himself lost. He never could drive at night worth a damn. Halpern mentioned the ledger and the fuel note, the uncredited bushels, the fact that the brake lines in the Chevrolet would be tested once the car was recovered. Victor's expression tightened. "You find that car first," he said. "Then we'll talk about brakes." Halpern looked past him into the barn. The smell of solvent hung faintly in the air. A workbench stood near the wall, littered with wrenches and tubing. A small hand-crank torch sat cooling on its side, flame tip still black. As Halpern turned to leave, Victor called after him, voice low. "Elias wasn't as honest as you think." The words followed him all the way back to town. 2 days later, a courier arrived from the Colden Co-op with a brown envelope marked Internal Record Request. Inside were photocopies of recent correspondence between Dunst and the regional board, among them a complaint about unauthorized private storage of grain at unregistered locations. The letter was unsigned, but the language hinted at insider knowledge. Halpern thought of Elias's careful note, "Ask V." He went back to the lake that afternoon. The ice had thickened again after a brief thaw, and the divers had been forced to postpone their descent. Halpern walked out 20 yards, careful to keep near the flagged markers. Through the milky surface, he could see shapes distorted by air pockets. At one point, he crouched and held his flashlight close to the ice. Something metallic glimmered far below, not a full reflection, more like a buried memory flickering in the dark. He imagined the Chevrolet's pale roof trapped under that frozen pane, its radio silent, its odometer fixed at the last mile Elias had ever driven. Somewhere inside would be the missing pages of the ledger, sealed in cold preservation. Evidence had a way of waiting. When he returned to his truck, a new report had come through. Someone from town had seen a light near the lake 3 nights before the disappearance, moving slowly as if someone searched for something they had already lost. Halpern read the line twice, then looked back toward the ice. The surface had gone perfectly still, reflecting the faint orange of the setting sun. The handwriting curved differently on the day he vanished. The thaw came early that year, slow at first, a faint weeping in the ditches, then all at once. By March, Lake Colden had begun to break at the edges, thin sheets drifting like glass across the surface. Constable Halpern stood at the shoreline with a thermos of coffee in one hand, watching the cracks form. Behind him, 2 RCMP trucks idled exhaust curling through the cold morning light. He had been waiting for this moment since the first day the car disappeared. They'd brought in a team from Edmonton divers accustomed to murky rivers and half-frozen reservoirs. The chief diver, a man named Curran, inspected the site with a clipboard and an easy confidence. "Depth. Here's about 20 feet, he said, stamping the ice. "Visibility near 0. We'll have to feel more than see." Halpern nodded. He'd mapped the coordinates the previous week, the same place where the oil sheen had been seen before the storm. The divers would go down at first light once they'd cut a proper hole through the crust. Marion Moreau had arrived earlier, wrapped in black. She refused to stand near the trucks, choosing instead the ridge overlooking the inlet. Her brother Victor stayed several paces behind her, smoking despite the wind. When Halpern approached, Victor asked, "You really think he's down there?" Halpern answered without turning. If not him, something he left behind. By 10 a.m. the ice saws began. The sound echoed across the lake, long grinding strokes alternating with the low drone of pumps. The divers suited up their gear, gleaming with frost. Karen lowered himself into the black water, first vanishing with a hollow splash. The line went taut. The second diver followed. Then the rope began to move, slow, deliberate tugs signaling contact below. Halpern paced the shore. Every few minutes he checked his watch. The air smelled faintly metallic, like pennies and cordyrain. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, one of the surface crew shouted, "They've found something." When the divers surfaced, their helmets glistened with oil film. Curran wiped his visor, nodded once. Metal frame. Looks like a car roof. Passenger doors sealed. We'll need a winch. It took another 2 days for the extraction rig to arrive. The winch truck rolled over frozen mud, its treads leaving deep scars along the shore. Chains clinked, pulleys groaned, and finally the surface broke open with a deep sucking sound. Water surged, black and cold. As the cables strained, the first piece emerged, a curve of chrome, followed by the full roofline of a Chevrolet Bel Air, pale blue, beneath decades of silt. Marion turned away when they lifted it onto the barge. The front windshield was cracked but intact, the driver's door still locked from the inside. They could see the silhouette of a man in the seat, head bowed slightly as if in prayer. Halpern took 3 steps closer but stopped short of touching the metal. "Leave the windows closed," he said. "No one opens that car till it's drained." By dusk, they had the vehicle on shore. Technicians moved around it in quiet rhythm, noting positions, angles, temperature readings. Halpern crouched beside the right rear tire. A single thread of rope still clung to the rim, old hemp, frayed, the kind used for hauling grain sacks. He cut a small piece, bagged it, and labeled it Shoreline Artifact. The next morning, under gray skies, they drained the cabin. Inside, they found Elias Moreau, hands folded loosely in his lap, seatbelt still fastened. The dashboard clock had stopped at 11:42 p.m. No sign of impact trauma, no blood. The key was in the ignition, turned halfway. To Halpern's eye, it was too neat a scene, arranged rather than suffered. The coroner's report was brief, cause of death drowning. But another note scrawled in the margin caught Halpern's attention, brake lines detached prior to submersion. He called the lab himself. The technician described a clean sever near the joint, not rusted through, not fractured. "Someone cut it straight," he said. Halpern drove back to the farm. Marion was sitting on the porch, ledger open on her lap. She didn't cry when he told her. She just stared past him at the field beyond the house. "He was afraid something like this would happen," she said quietly. "He said if anything ever went wrong, it'd come from people, not weather." Victor appeared from behind the barn, hands deep in his coat pockets. "You satisfied now?" he asked. "You've found your man. You've got your accident. Can we bury him?" Halpern didn't answer. He walked to the barn's open door and looked inside. A workbench stood against the wall, scattered with tools. A pair of wire cutters lay in plain view. He recognized the type, industrial, sharp enough for brake tubing. That night, Halpern sat alone in his office, writing the report by lamplight. The sound of the saw cutting through ice still rang in his ears. He turned the ledger's last page again, the column with the circled number. It was the same value as the missing grain load noted at the co-op. Outside, the storm returned, heavy and wet. Through the window, Halpern could see the reflection of the red ledger's spine under the lamplight, the ink glinting faintly where moisture had warped it. He thought of Elias beneath the lake, all those months, the ledger floating just beyond his reach. Beneath the ice, something metallic caught the weak spring light. By early April, the lake had cleared of ice, and the Chevrolet Bel Air sat beneath a canvas tarp in the RCMP impound lot. It looked less like a vehicle now, and more like an artifact, a ghost hauled from the dark. The silt had dried into crusted ribbons along the wheel wells, and the chrome had dulled to gray. Inside, the upholstery had shrunk tight against the frame, waterlogged pages of a sales manual clinging to the dashboard. Constable Halpern stood with his arms folded as the forensic mechanic finished his report. "No sign of collision," the man said. "No impact points, no fractures in the frame. Doors were locked from the inside, but the brake line, that's clean work. Someone cut it straight through before he hit water." Halpern nodded. He already suspected as much. Corrosion pattern, none that predates the cut. It's a knife or a saw, not age. When they pried open the glove compartment, they found a sealed envelope, warped but legible. Inside was a folded page from Elias's ledger, this one dated February 3rd, written in his neat block letters. Invoice dispute unresolved. No acknowledgement from Dunst. We'll speak directly next week. Beneath it, a single notation circled twice V, handled. Halpin set the paper on his desk later that night, the handwriting still visible under the blotches of moisture. V. He'd seen that initial before on the previous pages in different contexts, all casual references to Victor Landry. He underlined it once, then poured himself another cup of coffee and went back through the evidence list. The autopsy results arrived the next morning. Drowning, confirmed, but blood work clear, no alcohol, no sedatives, no head trauma. Elias had been conscious when the car entered the lake, yet the vehicle's ignition was halfway off, not running. To Halpern, that meant he had realized the brakes were gone only after he'd lost traction. A panic maneuver, maybe, or someone staged it that way to make it appear so. He drove back to the Moreau property under low cloud cover. Marion met him at the fence, arms wrapped around herself, the red ledger tucked under one arm as if it were a child. She didn't ask for updates. She already knew from his face. "They're saying accident," she said. "For now," Halpin replied. "Until I finish reading that ledger again." She hesitated before handing it over. Elias didn't write everything. Some pages he copied from receipts so others wouldn't see what he was planning. What was he planning? To pull his share out from the co-op? Start selling direct? He said too much of the crop was vanishing between scales. Vanishing how? "Paper vanishing," she said. "Ink." Halpin turned the pages carefully. Near the back, a slip of thinner paper had been glued between two thicker ones. When he eased it apart, faint pencil writing appeared, columns of figures corresponding to the missing grain loads. And beside them, initials RD and VL. That night, Halpin called the provincial office to request a warrant for both Dunst and Victor Landry. The authorization came before dawn. He arrived at Dunst's office first. The man was still buttoning his coat when the constable stepped inside. "If you've got questions, do it at the co-op," Dunst said. "I've got nothing to hide." "Then you won't mind me looking through your warehouse keys." Dunst stiffened. "You can't." Halpin produced the warrant. Within the hour, they'd opened the rear storage shed behind the elevator, the one Dunst had called obsolete. Inside were stacks of burlap grain sacks marked with false shipping tags and ledger fragments used as packing slips. Each carried the same pen ink as Elias's ledger. By evening, Halpin had enough to confirm embezzlement, but not murder. When he questioned Dunst about the brake line, the man's face reddened. "You think I killed him over bookkeeping? He was the one snooping around threatening to go to the board, so you stopped him first." "I didn't touch his car," Dunst said through clenched teeth. "Ask his brother-in-law. Ask who borrowed his truck last." Halpin said nothing. He already knew the answer. The next morning, he returned to the Moreau farm. Marion was gone to her sister's. The house felt emptied of sound. On the kitchen table sat the ledger open to the page with the hidden entries. A faint square of dust near the window suggested something had been removed, perhaps a small box or tin. He walked to the barn. Near the far wall where straw gathered in drifts, the floorboards seemed uneven. Kneeling, he pried one up with a screwdriver. Beneath lay a shallow cavity lined with burlap and a faint outline of something rectangular gone now. At the edge of the hollow, pressed into damp soil, was the shape of a small key. Halpin brushed the dirt aside. The imprint matched a lockbox keyhole perfectly. He photographed the imprint and replaced the board. On the way out, he noticed Victor's truck idling by the fence line. The man leaned out a cigarette between his fingers. "Find what you're looking for?" he asked. Halpin didn't answer. He just said, "Your sister's safe with family. You might want to think about doing the same before I come back." That night, Halpin wrote his report under the low hum of a desk lamp. Outside, rain swept across the empty streets. The photographs of the break cut the ledger, and the key imprint lay in a row before him, a quiet geometry of evidence. The cut was clean and made by someone who knew the machine. The spring rain turned the fields to gray rivers. Farm trucks groaned through the mud tires, spinning until they found gravel again. Constable Halpern drove the detachment sedan out to the Moreau property for what he told the dispatcher would be a courtesy visit. In truth, he needed to see the place after the thaw to feel what had changed and what had been unearthed. Marion met him at the gate umbrella, tilted against the drizzle. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "The insurance man came," she said before he asked. "He wanted the policy numbers." Elias had doubled the coverage last winter. Halpern frowned. When? 3 weeks before he disappeared. Paid the next quarter in advance. He made a note. It wasn't illegal. Farmers sometimes did that before calving season, but it meant someone had expected risk. "Did your brother know?" he asked. "He handled the payments," Marion said quietly. Elias didn't like banks. The barn door creaked behind them. Victor Landry stepped out, cigarette in hand, shoulders squared as if waiting for a fight. "You here to accuse her again?" he said. "She's had enough of your questions." Halpern turned. "Then maybe you'll answer them. When's the last time you saw the lockbox?" Victor's expression didn't flicker. "What lockbox?" "The one your brother-in-law kept under the floorboards. The one that used to hold his insurance documents." He dropped the cigarette into the mud. "If it existed, it's long gone now. Rats rot or rain." Halpern stepped closer. "Or maybe someone took it before the thaw." Victor smiled thinly. "You think I'd steal from family?" "I think you've been stealing from family for months." The two men stood in silence, rain ticking off their coats. Marion turned away, walking toward the porch. When Halpern finally left, she stayed there, arms folded tight, watching him drive off. That night, Halpern brought the ledger to the lab in Edmonton. The forensic technician, a woman named Corinne Vale, laid it flat beneath a magnifier. The pages had warped, but not destroyed the ink. Under a bleak light, faint indentations appeared, lines from a missing sheet once pressed between pages. She adjusted the lamp and traced the marks with a stylus. "Looks like an address," she murmured. "Then 4 digits, maybe a code or sum." Halpern leaned in. "Can you make it out? Something like Box 51742. The V felt like a wound on the page. He drove back through the rain that night, headlights cutting through mist. By the time he reached the farm, the property was dark. He parked down the road and walked the last stretch on foot boots, sinking into soft earth. The barn door was open again, a rectangle of shadow against deeper night. Inside, the smell of oil and hay mingled. He knelt by the floorboards where he'd found the key imprint days before. When he pried one plank loose, the soil beneath was freshly disturbed. He scraped his fingers through the wet dirt and found nothing but the edge of a burlap thread snagged on a nail. Whoever had retrieved the box had done it recently. A faint sound came from outside, a cough. Then footsteps. Halpern froze, listening. The steps retreated toward the fence, followed by the crunch of gravel and the low rumble of a truck engine turning over. By the time he stepped into the rain, taillights were already vanishing down the road. The next morning, the detachment received an anonymous call. A woman's voice, calm, low, almost resigned, reported seeing someone near the lake late at night, tossing something heavy into the shallows where the thaw water collected. No name, no description, just the place. Halpern arrived within the hour. The inlet was calm fog rolling off the surface in pale ribbons. He walked the bank until he saw the glint of metal half buried in mud. It was a key, small brass engraved faintly with the letter M. He turned it over. The teeth were worn smooth from use. Back at the station, he compared it against the photograph of the soil imprint from the barn. Perfect match. The mud had preserved its shape like a mold. Whoever had removed the box must have returned to destroy what it contained and dropped the key while doing it. He placed it in a new evidence envelope and labeled it Recovered Lake Colden Inlet. Item corresponds to missing lockbox from Moreau residence. That night, the rain stopped. The air smelled of thaw and diesel. Halpern sat at his desk, listening to the building creak as it cooled. He read through his notes one more time. The timeline was clear. Elias had discovered discrepancies, planned to confront Dunst, confided in Marion, maybe even in Victor. Days later, he was dead. The hardest part wasn't finding the truth. It was proving who had acted first. Dunst had motive. Victor had opportunity. But the lake had taken care of most of the proof. He closed the ledger, its red cover now dull with fingerprints and damp. When he placed it on the shelf, the corner of one torn page caught his sleeve, the February entry, the one marked V. Handled. He eased it loose and stared at the faint pencil marks beneath the ink. They formed two words barely visible now under years of water and pressure the box. Someone had opened the box before the thaw. The following week arrived clear and cold, the first true light after months of cloud. For the first time since winter began, Halpern could see the distant tree line without haze. It should have been reassuring, but it only made the emptiness feel wider. He had filed preliminary charges against Ray Dunst. Falsification of grain weights, misappropriation of cooperative funds, but the deeper question remained unanswered. Who had tampered with Elias Moreau's car? Halpern began again, from the beginning, the missing delivery, the torn ledger page, the lockbox, the cut brake line. Every thread led back to two men, Dunst and Victor Landry, joined by a single motive: money. Yet, motive was not proof, and the lake had washed away what mattered most. At 9 a.m. he met Dunst in holding for another round of questioning. The man looked smaller in the concrete room, his tie-gone fingers tapping the table. "You're charging me for fraud." "Not murder," Dunst said. "Don't pretend otherwise." "You were taking kickbacks on unlogged shipments," Halpern replied. "Elias caught you. He was going to the board." Dunst smirked. "So I kill him." "In February. Over barley." "You've never farmed, have you?" Halpern slid a photograph across the table, the severed brake line magnified to show the cut. "You used a tool like this?" Dunst looked frowned. "I've got hands, not surgeon steel. That's not me." "That's your brother-in-law?" Halpern waited silent. Dunst exhaled through his teeth. "Landry helped me move shipments after hours. We split profit, kept the books clean. He was supposed to talk Elias down, but something went wrong. Ask him how his boots got wet that night." At 10:15 a.m., Halpern drove north to the Landry farm. Victor met him by the machinery shed, wiping grease from his palms. "You've got nerve showing up here again," he said. Halpern held out a paper bag. Inside was the rope thread found on the Bel Air's rim. "Recognize it." Victor glanced once and shrugged. "Every farm has rope. This one's hemp twist industrial weave. Sold only through Dunst's supplier. Found tied around the car's rear wheel." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You think I tied it? I think you tried to guide the car down the ramp, keep it straight until the ice gave way." For a moment, Victor said nothing. Then his jaw twitched. He was dead before it went under. Halpern didn't move. The silence stretched between them, wind rustling the loose tin on the shed roof. "You're saying Dunst killed him?" Halpern said. Victor shook his head. "No. He just told me to get rid of what was left. Said there'd be money in it if I helped. Money for silence." Victor's laugh was hollow. "Money for everything. Elias was going to ruin us both." "Where's the lockbox?" Victor turned toward the field. "Gone. I tossed it in the lake. It's mud now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a matchbook, the same kind used at the co-op's office. He struck one, watched the flame sputter, then crushed it between his fingers. "He was already blue when I got there," he said quietly. "Sitting behind the wheel window, cracked. Looked like he'd fallen asleep. I thought maybe he wanted it." Halpern said nothing. He wrote slowly, letting each word weigh itself down. When he looked up, Victor was staring at the horizon. "You'll testify?" Halpern asked. "I'll tell you what I told God," Victor said, "but don't expect either of us to forgive." By dusk, Halpern's notes filled 4 pages. He returned to the detachment, locking the ledger, and Victor's statement in separate drawers. Outside, the last of the snow melted into black puddles that reflected the sodium lamps. That night, he reread the mechanical analysis one final time. The tool marks on the severed line matched the curvature of a specific type of handheld clamp cutter common to grain elevators for trimming metal tubing. Dunst had access to dozens of them, but the residue sample taken from the cut edge, a fine trace of red enamel paint, matched the handle of the tools kept in Victor's barn. That was enough. 2 days later, RCMP officers raided the Landry property. They found a torch, an enamel-coated clamp cutter, and a burlap sack containing soaked receipts, the same type used by Dunst's operation. Victor was taken quietly, head bowed, no struggle. Marion did not come outside. In the report that night, Halpern wrote that the cause of death was homicide by deliberate mechanical failure, and the primary suspect was Victor Landry, acting under the coercion or influence of Ray Dunst, whose fraud precipitated the event. The Crown would sort out the rest. When he closed the report, he saw the red ledger lying beside his desk again. It had become more than evidence. It was the story's spine, each page a confession written in ink before blood. He ran his thumb along its edge, tracing the groove where the final pages had torn free. Outside, the night was clear, stars glinting faintly above the prairie. In the quiet, he thought he could still hear the faint hum of a car beneath ice headlights, forever reaching for the surface. Every number in the book had become a nail in his coffin. The trial preparation dragged on through summer. Alberta's skies turned high and brittle, the fields dry enough to crack under a boot heel. At the detachment office, paper replaced soil affidavits, transcripts, and the quiet machinery of guilt. Constable Halpern spent most of his days sifting testimony that contradicted itself, one truth bleeding into another. Victor Landry's confession had stunned the district, but the Crown prosecutor wanted corroboration. Without it, Dunst could still argue that Victor acted alone, staging the accident for personal gain. Both men insisted the other had started it. Between them lay a dead farmer, a ledger, and a car that had gone to the bottom of the lake before anyone thought to look. Halpern returned to the lake in July, standing where the ice road once cut across the inlet. The water shimmered with algae, now green and thick, swallowing the last reflections of the ski. He thought of the Chevrolet resting somewhere beneath the surface again, stripped for evidence and now left to rot. What the divers had not found was the lockbox Victor claimed to have thrown back. If it existed, it had sunk deeper than they could reach. Marion Moreau kept to herself. She had moved into a small house on the edge of town, the farm sold to a cousin. When Halpern visited to finalize her statement, she met him at the door holding a tin of photographs. Inside was small, square Prince Elias standing beside the Bel Air, Victor on the combine, Marion herself in the doorway of the old farmhouse. Ordinary images, yet every one of them seemed to hum with the knowledge of what came later. "I don't want to see the ledger again," she said. "That book's cursed." "It's evidence," Halpern replied. "It's more than that," she said. He started writing different after Christmas, like he was hiding something from himself. Halpern didn't argue. He left the tin where it was and drove back to Colden under a white, motionless sky. That afternoon, he received the lab addendum from Edmonton, a final technical review of the brake assembly. The metallurgist's note was brief but decisive. Cut shows scoring consistent with manual clamping, using tool type identical to clamp cutters recovered from Landry property. Trace paint and particulate match. Mechanical intent confirmed. He read the line twice, then folded the report into his file. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted. No clean separation between greed and remorse, no redemption hidden in a confession, but it would hold in court. When the hearings began, the courthouse filled with neighbors and reporters. The story had traveled far by then. The Lake Colden case, as the newspapers called it, a name that made it sound almost literary. Marion testified briefly, voice, quiet hands folded around a handkerchief. She spoke of long winters, of money gone missing, of a husband who refused to join the silence. Dunst took the stand next. He looked older now, skin pale against his suit. He admitted to falsifying weights, to splitting profits, but denied any part in the death. "I told Victor to fix things," he said, "not to bury them." When it was Victor's turn, the courtroom air grew still. He spoke slowly, eyes down. "He called me that night," he said. "Said Elias was threatening to expose him, told me to make sure Elias didn't reach town. I only meant to scare him, but when I found the car at the lake, he was already still. I thought maybe the world had done what I couldn't." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor asked why he didn't tell the police. Victor's answer came as a whisper. Because by morning I wasn't sure who had killed him, me or the cold. The verdict came 2 days later. Dunst guilty of fraud and accessory to homicide. Victor guilty of manslaughter. The sentencing was heavy, the words dry and deliberate. Marion did not attend. When it was over, Halpern sat alone in the evidence room. The red ledger lay on the table before him, sealed in its plastic sleeve. Its pages were warped from the months underwater, but the ink still held the shape of Elias Moreau's hand. He turned the book gently, watching how the light slid over its surface. A young clerk entered, hesitating. "Sir," they said this should go to the archives. Halpern nodded. "Chain of custodies in order." "Yes, sir." "Then log it as Exhibit A." The clerk sealed the ledger, tagging it for transfer. As the door closed, Halpern remained seated, listening to the faint buzz of the overhead light. It sounded like wind over ice. He thought of all the small moments that had led here, the oil sheen on the frozen lake, the scrap of paper in the snow. Marion's trembling hands as she turned the ledger over. None of it dramatic, yet each detail had waited for years beneath the surface, patient as water. When he finally rose, he left the lights on. Outside, dusk stretched across the prairie, in a single, unbroken line, the kind that makes distance feel endless. Somewhere beyond it, Lake Colden darkened again, and for a heartbeat he could almost see the reflection of a car descending once more into silence. The last page had been torn clean out, not burned. The archives kept a smell all their own, dry paper dust and the faint sweetness of aging glue. 6 months after the trial, Constable Halpern walked the corridor beneath the courthouse, the echo of his boots chasing him down the tiled hall. He'd been reassigned to district oversight, a quieter post with fewer calls, but one envelope in the transfer file had his name on it. Material lockbox recovered. The accompanying note was brief. A maintenance crew draining a disused well on the east side of Lake Colden had found a small metal box lodged against a pipe. It was corroded shut, coated in silt. Inside, they'd discovered bundles of cash sealed in waxed paper and several slips of paper that had nearly fused together. Among them, receipts from the Colden Grain Cooperative and a photograph of Elias Moreau shaking hands with a man identified as Howard Galt, the local bank officer who'd authorized multiple short-term loans. Halpern laid the photograph under the lamp. Both men smiled at the camera, confident, ordinary, the handshake of a deal concluded. But the background caught his attention, a wall calendar behind them showing the month February 1954, the week Elias vanished. He turned to the cash bundles next. The bills were brittle edges, greened with oxidation. Each packet was wrapped in parchment and marked with the initials R.D. Ray Dunst. It wasn't merely payment, it was inventory. Halpern opened the report log and read the diver's notes. Moisture damage suggested the lockbox had been submerged during the first thaw after the disappearance, meaning someone had thrown it in within days of Elias's death. The mud layer adhering to its underside was identical to sediment samples from the lake's north inlet, the same site where the key had been found months earlier. He stared at the items on the table, money, paper, photo, and thought how every crime left its ghosts in ordinary things. Later that week, he visited Marion. She answered the door before he knocked, as if expecting him. The living room was tidy but stripped of decoration. On the mantel sat a single framed image, the farm under snow taken years before. "They found his box," Halpern said. Marion looked at the floor. "Then you know everything." "Not everything," he said softly. "There's a photograph. Elias and a banker." She nodded. "Galt lent him the down payment for that car. Elias didn't want to tell me. Said it'd make him look foolish, a farmer buying a car that fancy while owing half the valley." Halpern studied her face. "Did you know about the cash inside?" Her eyes flicked toward the window. "He said it wasn't ours. Said it was to make things right after the audit." "You think Dunst paid him to stay quiet?" "I think he planned to return it," she said. "He wanted proof first. That's why he kept writing even when no one would read it." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind press against the walls. Halpern noticed the red ledger still resting on a shelf, its spine cracked, pages swollen. It wasn't supposed to be here. It should have been sealed in the courthouse archive. "You kept this?" he asked. "They sent me a copy for insurance claims," she said, "but sometimes I think it's the real one." He didn't correct her. Instead, he opened it. The ink had faded further, but on one page, the same one where the code box fire 1742 had once been indented, someone had written in new pencil marks. Not numbers this time, but a short line of text. Tell him it wasn't the land. He looked up, but Marion had already turned away. "Do you know who wrote that? Maybe Elias," she said quietly. "Maybe someone who read him too closely." Halpin left without another word. That night, back in his office, he laid the lockbox contents side by side with the ledger copy. Every document told a story of debt, one measured in grain, another in silence. He compared handwriting ink, weight of strokes. The final note in pencil was newer, the graphite unoxidized. Someone had touched the book long after it had left the lake. He wrote an addendum to the file. Recovered lockbox establishes financial connection between Moreau, Dunst, and Landry. Presence of unlogged funds and signed receipts indicates collusion extending to bank oversight. Motive broadened beyond personal dispute. Evidence of external cover-up probable. It wasn't official procedure to reopen a closed case, but Halpin attached the report anyway. He sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing mail. When he stepped outside, the evening had gone silver with mist. The air smelled of silt and thawed grass. He stood there for a long while, imagining the lake as it had been frozen silent, holding its secrets beneath an unbroken surface. Somewhere in that silence, he thought he could hear the echo of Elias's handwriting, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man trying to set the world in order before it swallowed him whole. The handshake hid more than an agreement. It buried a season. The Colden Grain Cooperative sat at the edge of town, like an old scar, corrugated tin walls streaked with rust silos leaning against the sky. Halpin had passed it 100 times without stopping. But now, with the recovered lockbox in evidence and the old photograph staring back at him from his desk, he couldn't shake the thought that what they'd uncovered was only the surface of something deeper. He met with the Crown investigator at sunrise. Together they walked through the co-op's main office, the floor still dusted with grain from decades of shipments. The records room was silent except for the scrape of file drawers. The investigator handed Halpin a sheaf of requisition forms. "These are from the Dunst years," she said. "You'll want to see this." Each form listed outgoing bushels, dates, and recipients, but in the margins were tiny ledger codes that didn't match the cooperative's numbering system. They matched Elias Moreau's personal bookkeeping instead. Someone had copied the numbers from his ledger into official documents long after his death. Halpin felt a chill. Who handled these records after the trial? The investigator checked her notes. Transferred to the regional office in Calgary for audit, then sent back here when the cooperative folded in the 60s. "We only discovered them last month during a property survey." He took the pages to the evidence lab in Edmonton. Under low-angle lighting, the faint pencil strokes beneath the ink showed alignment marks someone had traced over Elias's handwriting to make it appear as part of the co-op's books. The analyst's conclusion was terse, ink layering and paper oxidation inconsistent with 1954 origin. Additions post-date 1959. Halpin read that line twice, realizing what it meant. The fraud had continued after the convictions. Someone else, perhaps even from within the bank, had kept laundering the same accounts using Elias's name as cover. The ledger hadn't ended the corruption. It had become a tool for hiding it. Back in Colden, he visited the abandoned office of Howard Galt, the banker, from the photograph. The building was slated for demolition, the walls covered with dust and old cobwebs. In the basement, he found a small safe bolted to the floor, rusted but intact. Inside were brittle index cards, client notes, and one envelope marked M. Estate. Inside, folded twice, was another of Elias's ledgers. Not the red one, this was blue, smaller, filled with meticulous entries that stopped exactly 1 week before he vanished. The handwriting on the last page stopped mid-sentence. "If this goes wrong, the land will speak louder than I can." Halpin set the book down slowly. The land had spoken through oil residue, waterlogged pages, mud imprints, and a single thread of hemp rope. Every clue had come from soil water or frost. Elias had left his truth buried in the only witness that never lied. He ordered a new search of the co-op's property records. The team uncovered additional discrepancies, unregistered land sales, forged titles, and falsified mortgage transfers, all signed during the years following Elias's death. It was clear that Dunst had been just one node in a larger chain. When the Crown prosecutor received the findings, she reopened the financial investigation. This time it wasn't just about fraud or manslaughter. It was about an entire rural network of kickbacks, where crops, cash, and silence had fed each other for decades. Halpern attended the first seizure personally. RCMP trucks lined the gravel road outside the old elevator. Inside, officers photographed stacks of decayed paperwork, rusted equipment, and a single filing cabinet, welded shut from age. When they pried it open, they found grain shipment receipts stretching back 40 years, some signed with Dunst's initials, others blank, but all showing the same ledger code pattern, M1742. The same code Elias had penciled into his hidden page. 4 decades, one officer murmured. They never stopped. Halpern said nothing. He only watched as they carried the documents out into daylight, the papers fluttering in the wind like feathers. That night, back at his desk, he wrote his final field report. It read less like an investigation and more like an epitaph. The disappearance of Elias Moreau precipitated exposure of a long-term embezzlement network operating under the cooperative system. Evidence indicates continued use of his personal codes post-mortem to sustain falsified accounts. The ledger recovered from Lake Colden functioned as both record and blueprint. Further proceedings transferred to Financial Crimes Division. He closed the file and turned off the lamp. In the silence, the office seemed to breathe. On the wall above the filing cabinet, the faint reflection of the window looked like a sheet of ice, dark, smooth, and endless. He thought of Marion again, how she'd said Elias wrote differently after Christmas. Maybe he'd known. Maybe the ledger wasn't confession or accounting at all, but a warning written in code only time could read. He pulled the red ledger from the evidence drawer one last time. Under the lamp, the ink gleamed faintly, not blue, but violet, a shade that seemed to shift with the light. Under fluorescent light, the ink still refused to fade. By the time autumn came, the case had dissolved into paperwork and memory. The provincial courts finalized sentencing for the remaining conspirators. The Colden Cooperative ceased to exist. Reporters lost interest once the story shifted from murder to accounting. Only the locals kept talking not about guilt, but about what the lake had given back. Constable Halpern attended the final hearing out of duty, not curiosity. Dunst was led in, wearing prison gray, his expression unreadable. He stared straight ahead as the judge listed charges: fraud, accessory to manslaughter, obstruction. Victor Landry was brought in next, thinner than before, eyes sunken but calm. He met Halpern's gaze only once a glance, neither angry nor pleading, simply exhausted. The sentences came down like the closing of a door. Dunst received 12 years. Victor 8, both reduced for cooperation. When it was over, Halpern signed the chain of custody release for the last remaining exhibit, the red ledger. Its pages, fused by moisture, had been photographed and copied, but the original was to remain sealed. He logged it personally, initials neat in the final box, delivered to Provincial Evidence Archive, October 1956. He didn't realize until later that he'd written the wrong year. After the hearing, he drove north instead of back to town. The highway shimmered with heat mirage fields stretching to the horizon in gold and rust. He passed the turnoff for the Moreau farm, now fallow house, sold barn roof sagging, and kept going until he reached Lake Colden. The water was still and clear, the shoreline ringed with reeds. A handful of gulls circled above. He walked to the edge where the old boat ramp ended. Bits of broken chain still lay embedded in the mud remnants from the recovery rig. He crouched there for a while, watching the wind draw ripples across the surface. From this angle, the lake didn't look wide, only deep. He took from his coat pocket a folded copy of the photograph recovered from the lockbox. Elias shaking hands with the banker, both smiling beneath the sign that read, Co-op Trust. He studied the faces again. Galt's grin looked forced, now almost grim. Elias, by contrast, seemed caught in a moment of conviction, like a man agreeing to something he already regretted. Halpern thought of Marion's words. He wrote differently after Christmas. He wondered whether Elias had realized that his ledger, the thing he trusted most, could be used to destroy him. Maybe the red ink had been his only defense, the stubborn act of recording everything so that the truth couldn't disappear even if he did. Back in town, Halpern began closing his files. He packed the case notes, the photographs, the typed confessions, and the coroner's summary into a single brown box labeled Moreau, Colden Lake Incident. He placed it on the shelf among dozens of others, each name a fragment of unfinished history. That evening, he stopped by Marion's small house. She was in the yard, pruning a dead rose bush. The air smelled of cut stems and early frost. She straightened when she saw him. "It's done," he said. She nodded once. "Is it?" He hesitated. "On paper." Marion brushed soil from her gloves. "Then maybe that's all it ever was. Paper and weather." Before he left, she handed him something wrapped in cloth, the old ledger copy she'd kept since the trial. "I don't want it in my house," she said. "Too many ghosts." He accepted it but didn't open it until he was home. When he finally unwrapped it, the first thing he noticed was the smell faintly of mildew ink and something metallic like the inside of a well. The pages had warped in strange waves, but the writing was clear. Elias's hand filled the margins with small notations, seed types, weight conversions, fuel costs. Yet between them were new pencil marks that hadn't been there before, thin crosses at random intervals, almost invisible unless the light hit right. He flipped to the back and found a single sheet glued against the inside cover. It was a page from the newspaper Colden Courier, May 1954, reporting the lake recovery. Beneath the printed text, a scrolled edition read, "The ledger speaks when men will not." He stared at the sentence for a long time, unsure if it was Elias's handwriting or someone else's. Then he folded the book shut. At headquarters, the final report circulated through channels, a bureaucratic postscript. The RCMP commended Halpern for his tenacious fieldwork under extreme environmental conditions. No one mentioned the other side of the story, the quiet corruption that had stretched beyond a single death, or how the soil and ice had conspired to reveal it piece by piece. On his last night in Colden, he returned once more to the impound lot, where the Chevrolet Bel Air had been stored before dismantling. The lot was empty now, marked only by tire tracks and rust stains. He stood in the middle of it, listening to the wind slide over the metal scrap. Somewhere beneath the hum of the highway, he imagined the faint echo of that engine turning over, steady, patient, unwilling to stop. When he filed his closing memo, he ended it with one line that no one would ever quote. "Some truths take water to rise." He could still smell the lake when he signed the report. 20 years later, a young cadet sorting through cold case archives in Edmonton came across a slim brown envelope marked "Retired Lake Colden File." The seal had half peeled away with time. Inside were a dozen brittle photographs, a copy of the coroner's summary, and a small handwritten note clipped to the last page of Constable Halpern's report. "See attached upbeard page source uncertain." The cadet unfolded it carefully. It wasn't typed like the rest. The paper stock was heavier, the edges faintly rippled. Across the top in dark blue ink, someone had written 2 words: "Final Entry." The handwriting was unmistakable, the same deliberate squared letters from the red ledger. But the content was strange. No numbers, no columns. Just a short line. "It's not the land that's drowning." No date, no signature. The cadet frowned, then walked to the microfilm desk to cross-reference the handwriting sample with known records. The registry showed the ledger had been sealed in 1956 under Halpern's supervision and never reopened. The envelope he held, however, was stamped 1968. He carried it to the archivist, an older man who'd worked the evidence vault for decades. The archivist squinted at the paper. "Strange thing," he said. "That file's been checked out twice, once by the court in 59, once by some researcher in 68. Both times it came back missing an item. Never the same one." "Who was the researcher?" The archivist shrugged. "Name redacted. Bank Commission, I think. They were cleaning up the last of the co-op fallout." That evening, curiosity got the better of the cadet. He requested the full Lake Colden case log from storage. The box arrived hours later, its tape dry and yellow. Inside were Halpin's notes, neat, organized, methodical, but one file folder was darker, as though it had absorbed moisture long ago. It bore a single tag, Unverified Exhibits. He opened it. Inside lay the missing red ledger, its cover warped but intact, the title embossed faintly with salt bloom. Tucked between its final pages was an envelope addressed in pencil to whoever reads last. The cadet hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single photograph, Lake Colden, taken from the ridge in early spring. The ice had melted into a perfect mirror, and in the reflection just beneath the surface, something like the outline of a car shimmered faintly, too defined to be a trick of light. On the back, in the same dark blue ink, someone had written, "Still here." He brought the ledger to the archivist, who looked at it and shook his head. "You'll need to log that. Halpern's case. Been closed since before you were born." "I know," the cadet said, "but I think it's incomplete." He spent the next week reassembling the record, the photographs, the break line reports, the transcribed confessions, the recovered lockbox inventory. Piece by piece, the narrative emerged again. The farmer's disappearance, the lake's reluctant testimony, the long uncoiling of rural corruption. Yet the last page, the one marked "Final Entry," refused to fit. The ink was wrong for 1954, and the watermark dated closer to 1967. Someone had added it long after Elias's death, but before the file's final transfer. He sent it for chemical analysis. The report came back 3 days later. Paper type consistent with RCMP field stationery, circa 1956-58. Ink composition consistent with fountain pen varieties issued to officers during same period. The cadet read the summary twice, then once more underlined the final sentence. He knew what it meant that Halpern himself had written the line maybe years after the case closed. He imagined the constable sitting at his desk long after retirement, the red ledger open the lake still lingering in his thoughts. Maybe the phrase had come to him as realization rather than confession. It's not the land that's drowning. Maybe it was the people, the ones who'd lived their lives counting, hiding, recording until truth itself had sunk beneath their own ledgers. The cadet refiled the case under Resolved Historical, leaving the envelope sealed again. Before turning out the light, he glanced once more at the photograph of Lake Colden. In the faint reflection, the car's outline was almost gone now, absorbed by water and light. He closed the box and wrote one last entry in the digital log. Case complete, evidence archived. But as he siled the lid, a small flutter of paper escaped, a page loosened from the ledger, curling onto the floor. He picked it up. On the back in pencil was a notation he hadn't seen before. Filed by H. March 12, 1956. He slid it back into the box and whispered, "Whoever reads last." Then he shut the cabinet drawer. The light in the vault flickered, once dimming, as if the room exhaled. In the end, the lake kept its truest secret.